Welcome, everyone. This is going to be our last legislative briefing for the year, if that's not obvious. It's an exciting week because the Congress is about to potentially pass a budget that will fund FY 2019, which last year, as you might remember, we had the threat of a government shutdown and an actual government shutdown. So it's not looking like we're going to have that this year, but we are going to get some updates on that. We're also going to talk about our upcoming Advocacy Day in Washington, D.C. in the early spring. We're going to talk about the state housing tax credit and some specifics around that. And then I will update everyone on other bills. We have two guest speakers today. We have Tori Beret from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who will start us off. And we also have Peter Kaplan, who is the chair of the policy committee, who will talk about the state housing tax credit. We're going to open up with Tori to talk about what's going on the national level. So Tori, take it away. Tori, you're muted. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. As Lavana mentioned, I'm Tori. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we advocate for the lowest income folks. We believe that everyone should have safe, decent, and affordable housing. And so I'm just going to give some updates, some exciting updates that are happening at the federal level. So I'm sure most of you all are really interested in what's happening with the budget. So for those that are unaware, the House and the Senate reached a final deal yesterday on the budget, and so the committees, that is. Basically, the overall spending bill provides HUD programs with more than $12 billion above the president's request. It largely funds HUD programs at or above levels that were proposed by the Senate earlier in the year, though not as high as levels proposed by the House, because they actually came up with their levels prior to the bipartisan budget agreement, so their levels were higher than what the Senate came up with. So with this spending bill, Congress rejected the administration's calls to cut housing programs and that strongly benefit low-income seniors and families, children and veterans, and others that need affordable homes. So the outcome is due to the work of the congressional champions, including Senator Collins, Jack Reed, Representatives David Price, and Mario Diaz-Balart, who are the chairs and ranking members of the House and Senate Transportation HUD Appropriations Subcommittees. So just to get a little more into the weeds, not too much into the weeds, but a little more into the weeds with what the bill contains, it increases funding for tenant-based rental assistance to $23.8 billion. It increases public housing capital funds to a total of $2.8 billion. It increases homeless assistance grants to $2.78 billion. And it increases project-based rental assistance to $12.6 billion. And then for choice neighborhoods, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, community development block grants, home investment partnership, Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities, and Section 202, housing for the elderly, they also received increased funding above fiscal year 19 levels. So public housing operating funds and Native American housing block grants were cut modestly compared to fiscal year 19 levels. And the spending package also includes $25 million for a mobility housing voucher demonstration to help families with children move to areas of opportunity. And it also provides $100 million in competitive grants to Native American communities to spur construction and preservation of affordable rental housing. It also includes strong language to require HUD to release critical mitigation funds for Puerto Rico that were approved by Congress over 2 years ago. And we're urging advocates right now, so there is something you can do. You can reach out to your members of Congress, your representatives, and your senators to ask them to please pass this final budget the spending package as soon as possible because the continuing resolution that is funding the government as is right now is due to expire on December 20th, which is on Friday. So we want to make sure that this package gets passed before then, so we're not dealing with any issues in terms of stopping funding or a government shutdown, which is what we had last year until February, which was devastating for families and folks living in subsidized housing. So we want to make sure we don't have that this year. So again, reach out to your legislators, and the House is expected to vote tomorrow. In the Senate, I think Thursday, we've been hearing, and like I mentioned, we have until Friday to make sure that this gets passed. So next, we are really excited because there's been some huge bills actually that have been released this year in the House and the Senate. So last week, actually, on December 12th, Senators Michael Bennet from Colorado and Rob Portman, who's a Republican from Ohio, introduced the Eviction Crisis Act. So this would create new tools to help end the nation's continuing eviction epidemic. So it would improve data collection to better understand the national eviction crisis, and it would expand support for efforts that reduce preventable evictions and limit the devastation to families where eviction is unavoidable. So the act would create a national database to standardize data and track evictions to better inform policy decisions. It would establish a federal advisory committee on eviction research. It would allocate funding for a comprehensive eviction study. It would provide funding for state and local governments that expand the use of landlord-tenant community courts. It would express support for substantial funding increases for the Legal Services Corporation to provide legal services to low-income folks. And it would improve information on tenant screening reports. And lastly, which we're really excited about and we've had involvement with, is it would establish an emergency assistance fund. So we have a multi-sector campaign, and they were critical in creating this emergency assistance fund and working with the sponsors to make sure that the language made sense. So to get into a little more detail about the emergency assistance fund, it's structured as a competitive grant program administered by HUD with input from the Department of Health and Human Services and from agriculture. So the grants would be awarded to states and local governments to establish crisis assistance programs to prevent extremely low-income households from experiencing housing instability, including an imminent risk of eviction or homelessness. And it would do this by providing short-term financial assistance and housing stabilization services. So at least 3/4 of the dollars must be used to provide direct financial assistance, and up to 1/4 can be used to provide wraparound services, such as counseling. And the bill also requires a rigorous evaluation of the program's effectiveness in preventing housing instability. And we do have a sign-on letter for this that you can send to your members of Congress. You can find it on opportunityhome.org/take-action. So I can mention where you can find these resources at the end too, but I just want to make you all aware that you can reach out to your legislators and ask them to support this and move this forward because, like I mentioned, it's bipartisan legislation, and it would do a lot to really help deal with and understand the eviction crisis. Another bill that we're really excited about is one that will be introduced tomorrow by Senators Chris Van Hollen from Maryland and Todd Young, who's a Republican from Indiana. And it's going to be called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. It would create an additional 500,000 housing vouchers for over 5 years, and it would be 100,000 vouchers a year. These vouchers would be geared specifically for families that have young children, so infants to 6 years old, and it would focus on ensuring that these families are able to move to areas of higher opportunity. So it would provide them with counseling and support to connect them to services in these areas of opportunity and to help them find housing in those areas. And then it would also enable housing agencies to implement practices to help all the families they serve by engaging new landlords in the voucher program, improving families' access to information about housing available in high opportunity areas, and identifying community-based supports for families when they move to new neighborhoods. And this legislation we really are excited about because it could largely eliminate homelessness among families with young children, as well as substantially reduce the number of children growing up in areas of concentrated poverty. And we also have a letter for this, so once this comes out tomorrow, you can send that along to your members of Congress to, again, encourage them to support this bill. And then lastly, another piece of legislation that we are also paying attention to, in addition to a lot of other pieces, but this is fairly recent, so I wanted to highlight this, is the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act. It's H.R. 4300, and it was sponsored by, actually, Pennsylvania Representative Madeline Dean, Steve Stivers from Ohio, who's a Republican, Mike Turner from Ohio, who's a Republican, and Karen Bass from California. So the House passed, actually, the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act by a voice vote on November 18th. It would expand the availability of family unification program vouchers for youth aging out of foster care. It would improve the voucher accessibility and allow vouchers to be administered when needed, subject to funding. So previous versions of the bill had included work requirements in order for the participants of the program to receive the vouchers. This iteration of the bill does not, which we are happy about. Instead, it would provide voucher recipients who are engaged in education, training, or work-related activities the opportunity to extend the use of their vouchers from 36 months to 60 months. So if they're engaged in any training programs or education or work, then they are able to extend the vouchers for 60 months. So if enacted, the bill would expand HUD's allocation of family unification program vouchers beyond the approximately 230 state and local housing agencies that can give them out now, improving accessibility and allowing vouchers to be administered when needed to foster youth at risk of homelessness. The bill would also require HUD to consult with the Department of Health and Human Services to encourage coordination between child welfare agencies and state and local housing agencies to help connect at-risk youth to vouchers. And the legislation would require state and local housing agencies administering the vouchers to develop a plan to connect youth to supportive services. And then again, we have another letter for this bill as well. There is companion legislation in the Senate. It hasn't moved yet, but you can encourage your senators to sign on to this legislation. And so that's my updates in terms of policy. I'm just going to mention briefly that we have our policy forum coming up from March 25th to the 27th. It's a great opportunity to hear members of Congress speak about housing, and you can also hear from experts in the housing realm as well. I know some of the topics we're going to be discussing this year is creating and sustaining multi-sector housing coalitions, resident-led movements, the latest research in affordable housing, Yes in My Backyard movement, healthy housing, in addition to many others. And there's also scholarships for people that are interested in attending. We provide housing. You just have to apply for a scholarship. We're always looking to give scholarships to new people who have not attended our conference before, and we do have very, very low discounted rates for people that are interested in joining but unable to attend because of cost prevention. And then also there's an organizing award that we give out to organizations that have been doing or succeeded in getting advocacy legislation, succeeded in getting legislation passed. So we highly recommend that if you have any organizations in mind that you think deserve to receive this award, that you submit an application. and that can be found on nlihcforum.org, as well as additional information about the policy forum. And we're also having our Lobby Day, which I know Gail is going to talk more about, but our Lobby Day is going to be on the 27th, where you can talk to your members of Congress about supporting affordable housing legislation and the need to fund programs at significant levels to help the affordable housing crisis. So that is all I have. Thank you so much, guys, for having me on.
Thanks, Tori. Just so you know, I put some of the links that you mentioned in the chat for folks who are on the online Zoom group, so you can share those. And we'll turn it over to Gail. Gail, I've unmuted you to make a quick announcement, and then I'll unmute everyone for questions about federal stuff.
Yes, thank you. So hi, everybody. This is Gail Schwartz, based here out of the Pittsburgh office of the Housing Alliance. As Tori mentioned, with the policy forum that the National Low Income Housing Coalition is going to be hosting, there will be a Capitol Hill Day. The Housing Alliance has long had the practice of partnering with one of the national organizations to invite our membership to DC to participate in advocating for resources at the federal level. Historically, we've done this in the late summer in conjunction with the National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference. However, this year we are making a switch, and we are going to be doing it in conjunction with the National Low Income Housing Coalition Policy Forum in March. So we are going to be sending out the save the date early in the new year. And for those who have ever attended the Capitol Hill Day in July, while we most certainly encourage you to attend the policy forum, you most certainly do not actually have to attend the policy forum to participate in our Capitol Hill Day. So please be aware of that. And then again, we will work with all Pennsylvania attendees of the conference, as well as anybody in our membership who wants to come to DC just for the day. We will schedule the meetings, we'll get packets together. The National Low Income Housing Coalition will have some preparation webinars to talk about the policy asks. The Housing Alliance will also have our own preparation webinars, again, to reinforce sort of how the day will flow and what the policy priorities are. So again, it's no cost to actually participate in the event, but you are responsible for your own travel. We do encourage folks with lived experience, especially if you are able to bring some of those folks down, we are happy to help sort of maybe figure out travel arrangements, whether it's, helping negotiate a ride share or things like that. But again, any questions you have about that, I am the staff person who's going to be the point person for organizing that. So I am available at any point to talk out ideas of how we can get those who are most closest to the need able to participate fully in those advocacy opportunities. And like I said, more details are to come in the new year. And with that, I will pass it back over to Lavana.
Great. So I wanted to pause here to give everyone a chance to ask questions. So I just unmuted everyone. And if you have a question and you want to chime in about anything that Tori talked about or about our Advocacy Day in March, feel free to jump in. You can also type questions into the chat if you're using the online tool.
Tori, could you talk a little bit about the Tax Credit Improvement Act and what's happened with that, with the overall tax credit extenders legislation?
Sure. So we are advocating for the Tax Credit Improvement Act as well, which would make it applicable to better assist or make it more compatible with affordable housing projects. And it was supposed to be included in the tax bill, but it was taken out of it last night. And so we're not sure if it's going to, we have a feeling it's probably not going to move forward this year, but it will most likely be reintroduced again in 2020.
Great, and we'll keep everyone updated on that one as well. That's something we've been talking about in previous policy and legislative briefings, so we'll make sure to keep everyone up to date on what's going on with that. Does anyone else have any questions? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Savannah. We do have a fact sheet on that, so if you want, I can actually add it to the chat.
Sure.
So you guys can take a look at that.
Great. Any other questions about that or other about our advocacy day or any other issues that Tori brought up? I will just mention that tomorrow when you receive our newsletter, you'll note that we are featuring the action to encourage Congress to pass a complete budget by the end of the week. So if you want to take that action, it'll be in the newsletter tomorrow, and I'll also include it in our summary from this call. But as we remember, the government shutdown was pretty destructive last year, so we really want to encourage them to move forward and pass the budget by this Friday.
And if they do end up not passing something, we updated our membership, and I would be happy to update the Housing Alliance about actions that we are doing, but we made sure to put it in the media and get attention on the fact that low-income folks living in subsidized housing were really affected and were not being communicated to about what was going to happen to them, and they were getting no updates, and so everyone was panicking, and it just was not a good situation last year. So fingers crossed that budget will be passed and we won't have to deal with that, but if it is something that happens, we will, of course, update people and make sure we're on top of getting as much attention to the issue as possible.
Great. All right, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone again for a second, and then you are still able to unmute yourself at any time if you choose, but I'm gonna turn it over to Peter. And Peter, I believe I just unmuted you so that we can talk a little bit about the state housing tax credit.
That sounds great. Can you hear me, everyone?
I can hear you.
Great, wonderful. Okay, well, I'm Peter Kaplan, and I'm the Policy Chair of the Housing Alliance Board of Directors, and I'm here today to ask all of you to support legislation to create a state housing tax credit program for Pennsylvania. I'm going to briefly explain the proposed state housing tax credit, why we need it, and offer three main reasons that you should support enactment of the credit. I'm then going to explain how you can support this really important housing legislation. And to help you advocate for the state housing tax credit, we will be sending you an advocacy and information package after the briefing, and I think some of you will be able to see part of it online if you're participating visually. First, let me explain what the state housing tax credit is. The state housing tax credit programs have been enacted by 15 states and Washington, D.C. These programs allow investors to receive state tax credits, a dollar-for-dollar reduction in their state tax obligations for investments they make in rental housing that is affordable to low-income households. Like most of the state programs, the proposed Pennsylvania State Housing Tax Credit will be modeled on the highly successful federal low-income housing tax credit program. The federal low-income housing tax credit program produces about 90% of affordable rental housing in the United States. We need a state housing tax credit because despite the success of the federal housing tax credit, there remains a shortage of over 300,000 affordable and available homes for low-income renters in Pennsylvania. For this reason, the creation of the state housing tax credit is currently the top legislative priority for the Housing Alliance. The most important reason to support passage of the state housing tax credit is that it will create more affordable housing in Pennsylvania. The legislation creating the state housing tax credit provides for an annual allocation of $2 million in new tax credit awards over a period of 5 years. So a total of $10 million in tax credits will be provided each year. Like the federal housing tax credits, the state housing credits will be sold to investors at prices determined by competition between prospective buyers. And like the federal housing credits, the state housing credits will be allocated to housing sponsors by the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, or PHFA. Because the pool of state housing credits will be a fraction of the federal housing credit pool, we expect that state credits will be used primarily to fill funding gaps for developments that are receiving a larger allocation of federal housing credits. We believe that the annual $10 million allocation of state housing credits will lead to successful completion of housing developments that otherwise would not occur. For example, if the state housing credit is used to fill funding gaps in 9% federal tax credit developments, PHFA will be able to fund more of these developments with those coveted 9% federal credits and thereby create more high-quality affordable housing. A second major reason to support the state housing credit is that it will be attractive to investors and unlock capital for the creation of affordable housing. We are absolutely certain that the state housing credit will be attractive to investors because the demand for the federal low-income housing tax credits available in Pennsylvania greatly exceeds the supply of credits. Every year in Pennsylvania, housing sponsors submit 3 9% federal tax credit applications for every one that can be funded. Each of these applications has a prospective credit buyer who is interested in investing in that development. That means that there's private capital that can be, but is not currently, harnessed for the creation of affordable housing. A final reason to support the state housing tax credit, and one that I think should be especially persuasive to undecided legislators, is that the state housing tax credit will create jobs and other economic benefits for Pennsylvania's economy. Using a very well-accepted economic modeling techniques, the Philadelphia firm eConsult Solutions has estimated that in Pennsylvania, every $10 million in affordable housing construction will generate $19.6 million in total economic impact and support 110 jobs. Once housing is built, the housing creates lasting economic benefits for communities and their residents. Well-maintained affordable housing can stabilize and strengthen neighborhoods, benefit local businesses, and an often overlooked benefit is that it provides stable housing for the local workforce. The Housing Alliance has produced a really terrific 2-page brief which illustrates the economic multiplier effects of investments in affordable housing, and it's included in the package that you're going to receive after the briefing. Now I'd like to talk about where the state housing tax credit legislation stands and how you can help enact the credit. The legislation that would create the state housing tax credit, known as Senate Bill 30, was introduced in the Senate earlier this year by Senator Thomas Killian, who's a Republican from Chester and Delaware counties. 19 of Pennsylvania's 49 state senators, 5 Republicans and 14 Democrats, have signed on as sponsors of this legislation. It's currently under consideration by the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senator Patrick Brown, who's the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee and a sponsor of Senate Bill 30, has promised that the bill will be passed by the Appropriations Committee early next year. After that, we're going to be working for a quick passage through the Senate and then asking the House to pass the Senate bill. We're going to really need your help to ensure passage of SB 30, first by the Senate and then by the House. Right now, you can contact your state senator and express your support for SB 30. When you write, share your story. Tell your senator why increased production of affordable housing is important to you and the people and the communities that you care about and work with. And as SB 30 progresses through the Senate and is considered by the State House of Representatives, the Housing Alliance will keep you informed by email and suggest further actions you can take to advocate for SB 30. And there'll be more information about how you can do that and how to do that through the package that we'll be sending out after the meeting. But I do want to close that part of it by saying that any letter or email to your senator or representative increases the likelihood that we will enact a state housing tax credit. I want to finish on just a final note, which is that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that 15 other states and Washington, D.C. have some form of state housing tax credit. Compared to some of these states, we are proposing a relatively modest program for Pennsylvania. Several states, including California, Colorado, Georgia, Hawaii, Missouri, and Nebraska, have set the amount of state housing tax credits as a percentage of the total federal credits allocated to their states. And those percentages range from 20% to 100%. I mention this because if the state housing tax credit is well accepted in Pennsylvania, as we expect, there may be an opportunity to expand the credit to provide more resources to meet Pennsylvania's tremendous need for affordable housing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. And I have been sharing my screen for those of you who are using the online portion of the tool so you can see what the packet looks like. And then I will also send an email out to everyone who signed up for this call, sharing this with you as well. So with that, I'm going to pause again and unmute everyone, and feel free to pop in if you have a question, or you can write something in the chat as well. Does anyone have any questions about the state housing tax credit?
I will also mention that that there is, not to, of course, anyone fire away with your questions, but we do have a frequently asked questions piece that is that will be included in the package that you'll be sent, and it does answer a number of different questions that, if they don't happen to occur to you right now, that you'll be able to consult after the meeting.
Great. All right.
Hi.
Oh, go ahead.
Yep. Hi, this is Tim Whalen with the Cumberland County Housing and Redevelopment Authorities. We are big fans of this state tax credit because we've seen really good, high quality, good projects get turned away. And we've also seen, in particular, with the HFA moving making their decisions, that there's not enough money, and so being able to use these dollars as another way to fill some of these funding gaps is just going to be so important, because as you've seen, construction projects are getting more and more expensive, and those funding gaps are getting wider and wider, and the traditional ways that those things have been filled through, say, like home funds or affordable housing trust funds, there are just not enough dollars in those traditional pots. So having the state tax credit is going to go a long way in helping to create the financing that's going to be needed for new high quality projects around Pennsylvania.
Great, thanks, Tim. We appreciate the comment, and we agree completely that there's not enough. There are so many great projects that need to move forward, and we hope that this will fill the gap for some of those key projects. And like Peter said, once we move forward on this, if we're able to expand it, we'll be able to move even more things forward. So thanks for that. All right, any other questions? Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and mute everyone again. And before we close, I wanted to share just some other bills that are currently moving through the legislature related to housing and to blight. So I'm actually also going, for those of you who are participating in the online tool, I'm also going to share my screen as I walk through this legislative report that I put together, and I will share this report with everyone after the call as well. I'm skipping over the federal stuff because we already talked about that, and I'm going to skip over the state housing tax credit because we just talked about that. As everyone remembers, this session we're able to lift the cap on FAIR as part of the budget process, so $15 million more were added into the FAIR fund, which will help more projects move forward. But some of you may not know, because this just happened in November, right before the conference. But for those of you who are working on the blight front, the Uniform Definition of Blight, or HB 407, passed and was signed by the governor on November 7th. This is very key legislation to helping move more other pieces of blight legislation and also blight programs forward by having this uniform definition. So this was something that was a fix that was created a couple of years ago, and we're really happy to see it pass this session. Just recently, in October, Senator Hughes introduced a bill called the Safe Housing Trust Fund. And what that bill would do would be to create a $15 million housing trust fund just for survivors of domestic violence, specifically to go towards permanent housing solutions. So this is a brand new bill. We're just starting to see people show their support for it on both sides of the aisle, and I wanted to make everyone aware of it because I know this is a critical issue across the state. We'll be following that, and we are supporting it. The accelerated eviction bill, which we are opposing, was set on the calendar for December 16th, which was yesterday in the House. As far as I can tell from what the reports that I've seen, there was no movement on that. This is something that we've been opposing because it shortens the period of time after which a landlord can give a person to vacate a unit, and we believe that the 21 days that are currently in place gives people more time to find a housing replacement as opposed to potentially causing a family or resident to become homeless by shortening it to 12 days or 2 weeks. So we are discouraging this bill. I do anticipate that it will pass the House, but I think it will see more opposition in the Senate. We are also opposing a bill that would change the current process to remove people from a property from a court process to a police process. This is commonly known as the squatters bill. It's not necessarily related to squatters, but it's related to any resident of a property who does not have a legal lease. We believe that this bill will have unintended consequences, specifically around victims of domestic violence. So we are encouraging them to rethink that legislation. It hasn't moved past the House Judiciary Committee. Excuse me, it moved past the House Judiciary Committee, but it is currently in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. So we're hoping that the authors of that bill will rethink the way it's written, because I think they didn't realize about the unintended consequences. We are also working to make small changes to the current prevailing wage legislation, just related to small projects. That bill was introduced on June 17th, and it has not moved forward since. We are seeing a lot of action on blight-related legislation. On October 30th, there was a big hearing in terms of changing the process for tax sales, basically moving the enforcement of whether people can participate in tax sales to the front of the process as opposed to after the process. So essentially, the current law says that if you have delinquent taxes or if you have a serious code violation, you're not allowed to participate in a tax sale. But the only way that's enforced is by signing a self-reported affidavit in advance of the tax sale. Now we're going to ask people to report their identity so that we can, or so that municipalities can check to see if they have delinquent taxes or code violations prior to the tax sale. This bill was scheduled to be voted on in the House yesterday, but it was a really busy day, and I don't think it actually made it to the finish line. There are still House session days this week, so we'll see what happens. And there are quite a few other blight bills that are moving too that I want to specifically mention. Are tax abatement for blighted properties, which is a bill that was introduced by Senator Judy Ward, who's the chair of the House Urban Affairs Committee in the Senate. That would essentially create a tax abatement process to redevelop blighted properties. And that bill's been moving pretty quickly, and we anticipate that it will pass this session, as well as a bill that we are promoting that would allow land banks to be designated as economic development agencies, which essentially provides them the legal status that they need to redevelop brownfields. So those two bills are moving pretty quickly. They were both scheduled for a vote yesterday, and I don't think that it happened, but it could still happen this week. So we'll have a lot to report on in the new year. With that, I'm going to stop sharing. I will send the full report of all the legislation around to everyone. And I will go ahead and unmute. Hang on one second, I just need to get to the right place. And just see what general questions people have before we close. Does anyone have any other questions before we close?
Lavana, I have one question, and that is, what is
Sure.
the Senate bill number of Senator Hughes' bill concerning the Housing Trust Fund for Victims of Domestic Violence?
It is SB 913.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, well, we have a lot of follow-up materials to send around, so we will do that shortly, and I will share the recording. I want to thank Tori and Peter. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us today. And I'll say goodbye. Thanks all. Have a great week and have a great holiday.
You well.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Take
thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Same to you. Happy holidays.